Hi, my name is Jina Kim. I am a professor at the University of Oregon, teaching in the Department of East Asian Languages and Literatures. I am a specialist in Korean literature and cultural history and literary criticism. I am very, very happy to be participating in the TAIWANfest 2021 that is finally taking place after an unfortunate interim last year. My book that I had recently published is a comparative study of Taiwan and Korea. And it specifically looks at the Japanese colonial period, which is from the late 19th century to the mid 20th century for Taiwan. And of course, basically the first half of the 20th century in South Korea, in Korea in particular. As a way to think about Taiwan and Korea and its similarities and differences, I thought I would do this through thinking about a topic on cultures of protest. That is, as many of you might realize, East Asia, which includes Taiwan, has experienced a number of protests in the 20th century. As we speak, we have recently experienced protests in Hong Kong, and of course, protests in the US that involved Asian Americans, especially as a result of coronavirus in the past year. What I have found in my research on cultures of protest is that, of course, these protests are sometimes successful, sometimes they are not as successful, but many of the protests that have taken place in Taiwan and in Korea in the early 20th century and throughout the rest of the 20th century have been rather successful in moving the country toward democracy and democratization. And the two works that I will be looking at are Park Kwan-seo's Mother's Stake, or 엄마의 말뚝, and Ju Tianxin's Gudu, or the Old Capital, as it was translated into English. These are two contemporary novellas by female authors, which probe and trace the urban histories of colonial Korea and Taipei, respectively, from post-colonial temporalities and spaces. These novels were written in the 1980s and 1990s. Thus, these two writers are looking back to the colonial period. These two works critique the contemporary conditions of the city and the nationalist versus anti-nationalist histories that have left people, both Taiwanese and Koreans, more isolated from their pasts and displaced from a sense of belonging in the present. In both novellas, the female narrators come to this critique through remembering and tracing the urban spatial histories of the city under Japanese colonial rule. While on the surface, both narratives appear to recall the past uncritically and even nostalgically, which is what many people have often said about the way that Taiwan has and Taiwanese people have described the past, and especially the Japanese colonial period. I argue that they both embed a pointed critique of the standard binary historical narratives of resistance versus submission and nationalist versus anti-nationalist espoused in characterizing colonial and post-colonial Korea and Taiwan. What I find these two novels to be very important even now as we read them in the 21st century in 2021 is that these novels or novellas engage in the work of protest. Again, the two novellas that I am introducing here, and which I will give a little bit more background and analyze, engages with the effects, mutations, and evolutions of the colonial past, and it still powerfully lives on in the urban landscapes and institutions and discourses and cultural productions. So while I said that many protests, physical, social, and political protests in the 20th century in Korea and Taiwan have been very, very successful in bringing about democracies. And I completely acknowledge and respect the kind of work that activists have done on the ground. Here in my presentation, I want to see and examine how these two female writers writing in the late 20th century have also engaged in the democratization movement through their literary works. Park Wan-seol's Mother's Stick, or Amma의 말뚝, is about a young daughter who is arriving in Seoul from the countryside. She was living with her grandparents, but her mother is bringing her to Seoul in order to make her into a new woman, or 신여성. So the daughter arrives at her new home in Seoul, and she is kind of perplexed, and she asks her mother, is this Seoul? Where are we living? The Seoul that she sees is not the kind of Seoul that she had imagined and heard of. The Seoul she sees and the alleys up to our new home are like, I quote, like the inner lining of a cow's stomach that is shabby, unruly, and endlessly foul. And so the daughter cynically asks, is this Seoul? To which her mother immediately responds, quote, nope, we're not really in Seoul. This is outside the gate, unquote. The mother then firmly tells her that this is where they will be living until her older brother becomes successful. And this is the daughter's very disappointing initiation into living her everyday life in Seoul and in a neighborhood called Hyunjo-dong. It was a neighborhood that was impoverished, and as it was the case with the narrator or the protagonist in Park Wan-seol's novella, they were mostly people who were displaced by colonialism, and they were also people who were trying to leave their rural homes to make a new kind of life in Seoul. What is very interesting, of course, is the way that this neighborhood during the post-war period, especially as Korea was experiencing democracy, and just as Taiwan had become, Taiwan's martial law was lifted in 1987, South Korea also underwent a very important change in that it moved from military rule to civilian rule. That is, for the first time in 1987, a president is elected by popular vote, although from 1987 to 1992, the person who was elected was a former military leader. We have, for the first time, through popular protests and democracy movements, lifting of martial law, a shift from military rule to a constitutional rule. But while this is happening, we also see that many people who have once made their homes in Hyunjo-dong or neighborhoods like Hyunjo-dong are being displaced as a result of urban renewal and urban development. And on the right, you see a photograph, and this is a photograph taken most recently, and it's an ad from a real estate agency where this neighborhood was completely demolished. All the homes were toppled, and in place, of course, these high-rise apartments were built. And while this, of course, seems like it's progress and it's improvement, the people who were living in these towns, these neighborhoods, were displaced. They had to leave their homes and find a more affordable housing. obviously they were not able to afford the kind of luxurious high-rise apartments that were being built in replace of these smaller traditional homes. Zhu Tianxin's the novella, The Old Capital, also looks at a specific time and place, and it goes back to the Japanese colonial period. Zhu Tianxin's novella, The Old Capital, is also a trilogy, as Park Wan-seo's Mother's Stake was a trilogy. And both of these novellas are divided into 3 parts. And in the first part of The Old Capital, the protagonist, or the narrator, who is a well-educated modern woman, she endlessly strolls around Taipei feeling increasingly isolated. And despite the fact that the city is supposed to be familiar to her as her home, she is feeling quite displaced. In the second part of the novella, the protagonist takes a trip to Kyoto to meet her friend. And here the protagonist recalls Taipei of her young childhood. And in the last part, the novella tells of her return from Kyoto and retracing Taipei as if she were a Japanese tourist with an old colonial period Japanese guidebook and map. So the narrative of this novella spans about 20 years from the protagonist's days at high school to 1996, when she is in her late 30s and has become a mother herself. The protagonist's memory weaves back and forth between the past and the present. As some of you might know, Zhu Tianxin is a daughter of a very famous writers, and they are also part of a family that had migrated from China in the post-1949 era. And the military families that had settled in Taiwan in the post-1949 era were given housing, and they were called military dependent villages, or zhuangchun. And this on the left is a image of a still remaining zhuangchun, as well as in the foreground of this image in the front. This is a remaining military dependent village. Of course, in this image on the right, you see new luxury apartments that are in the background. Although I say background, it's almost the foreground, in that it's towering over the dilapidated one-story buildings that are soon to be, of course, demolished in order to be replaced with other luxurious high-rise apartments. And thus, what we see here is quite an interesting similarity, especially in terms of the urban landscape that we find in the colonial period and in the post-colonial period, and especially during the military dictatorship era of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, and even in the post-martial law era in the 1990s, when many of these villages, shanty towns that have been homes to many migrants and are being demolished, and many people are being displaced out of their homes. And furthermore, Zhu's novella both inscribes and extirpates history onto or from the city to note what it means to not only be not only Chinese or Taiwanese, but otherwise as a people of global modernity, especially considering the fact that now Taiwan, and Taipei in particular, is considered to be a megacity and part of the global, the global modern cosmopolitan world. How has the post-martial era and it's all its glories, all its positive acknowledgments, and of course, both Taiwan and Korea's democratization and economic growth, enormous economic growth, have both of these countries actually achieved and arrived at a place that does not require this violent kind of sorrow. Have they come to some kind of resolution with the atrocities of the past, whether it's colonial past or the military dictatorship? And so I end with the two images here in the 21st century. As I said, now Taiwan and South Korea are both economic powerhouses in many ways. They have become very successful economically. They have become models of political democracies. And as these two images of these two very tall buildings, Taipei 101 on the left and the Lotte Tower on the right in Seoul attest, it seems as though Taiwan and Korea have arrived, but at what cost? And what in the future, in the years to come in the 21st century, can we expect Taiwan and Korea to do in terms of becoming even a more of a democratic nation that does not displace identities, multiple identities, and multiple spaces, and the heterogeneous histories that need to be accounted for? Thank you. I guess if we were to again make some kind of parallels or comparisons between Taiwan and Korea, I can think of, for example, the North-South Korea division, and of course, who supports North, who's anti-North. And it is, I think there is a very interesting contradiction that we can map onto South Korea's case as well. Of course, there's this very strong anti-communist propaganda and rhetoric that pervaded South Korea for a very long time, especially in the post-war period. And what is interesting, and I guess this is where I would see the comparison happening, is the current progressive government in South Korea is very pro-North Korea, right? They want to think about building friendly relationship with North, working towards reunification, if not reconciliation. At the same time, what you find is that the North Korean defectors who are in South Korea, because they have left the North Korean regime, are not treated as well by the progressive government. But at the same time, there is somewhat of a contradiction, because the defectors, North Korean defectors who are in South Korea currently working as activists, trying to bring about awareness about human rights in North Korea, human rights violation in North Korea, are very much restricted by the current progressive government. And of course, the current government's rationale or reasoning is that, well, they want to make better, they want to improve relations with North, and if they support the defectors or the North Koreans who have left North Korea to resettle in South Korea, that's not going to be conducive, or it's not going to encourage these better relations. So it is then the more conservative party in South Korea who have embraced the North Korean defectors in South Korea. So in some ways, it's not exactly same parallel, but I can see the kind of contradictions that are intertwined in both South Korea and Taiwan in terms of two, of course, the other, whether it's China or North Korea. These, because they are an interesting case where women writers had a important place, or was breaking out and being heard, being published, and becoming bestsellers in their own respective countries, especially in the 1990s. And this, I think, is probably as a result of various things, multiple things, but one because of the opening of the country, both of these countries, towards a new era, and in terms of thinking about women's literary production and cultural productions being accepted or acknowledged as an important contribution to the writing of national histories, which wasn't always the case in the past. Thus, there is, I think, on the part of both feminists in the 1990s in Taiwan and in South Korea, as well as women writers who were actively participating in vocalizing their opposition to patriarchal societies. What is also very interesting and important is that while Taiwan and Korea was moving away from military dictatorship and martial law, while that was happening, it wasn't always the case that patriarchy was being broken down. And thus, it was, I think, an important decade in the 1990s when women were gaining they were gaining a greater presence in the public era, the public space, whether it was in politics or in cultural productions or in education, that they were able to contribute or to voice some of these oppositions against traditional Confucian patriarchal practices and Confucian patriarchal order that was still, I think, pervasive in the 1990s. In terms of South Korea, Christianity had taken on, of course, it entered in the late 19th century, and it was, of course, blooming in the early 20th century, and it was seen as something that was helping to modernize Korea in various ways, whether it is women's education or literacy, and thus, and also in different kinds of human rights and social movements, Korean missionaries from abroad, and of course the growing Christian community was also participating in the modernization and democratization process. And so I think scholars have looked at, for example, the relationship between Korean Christians and Christianity, and especially Protestantism or evangelism in South Korea, and its various there are various roles in the democratization movement. No, I'm not. I've heard of it, but I'm not aware of them in great detail, or I haven't read anything or talked to anyone specifically about this very interesting group of Korean Chinese or Chinese Koreans who are now living in Taiwan. But it is interesting that what happened in Korea, unlike many other places, is that there is the Chinese community, expat community, or Chinese Korean community often have not been recognized by either the Korean government or by the Korean people themselves in not only marking them as Korean, right, but also in many ways there was even attempt at not marking them as Chinese. So in some ways, I can see how people might have chosen Taiwan maybe as a third place, right, to go to in the absence of being recognized neither in China or in Korea. So that is a very interesting phenomenon. But it is interesting how that connection between Korea and Taiwan and its shared experiences are not acknowledged as much. And just as in the case with the Korean Chinese who moved to Taiwan, I think is a fascinating area for us to further explore and study and connect Taiwan and Korea together.